back to Defence Talk, Securing UK Advantage, a podcast brought to you by the Council on Geostrategy in partnership with trade association ADS Group and sponsored by industry powerhouse BAE Systems. Every 2 weeks, our podcast discusses key questions that shape defence, technological and national security agendas in the UK, and explores the main themes in British defence in the context of intensifying geopolitical competition. In today's episode, coinciding with Spacecom's Expo 2024 taking place in Farnborough this week, we will focus on an exciting topic of space. As a recent report of the Council on Geostrategy authored by space expert Gabriel Eleftheriou observed, without a space recognized as a province of all mankind, civilian space affairs traditionally have had a different status than other strategic domains, often rising above the politics of the day and focused on exploration and science. Yet increasingly, space power is being linked to counter-space capabilities, sensitive security considerations and national interest calculations, and the governments are therefore reasserting their primacy in space affairs on strategic grounds. At the same time, the new space economy has likewise expanded extremely fast over the past decade, tapping into a mix of commercial opportunity and plummeting barriers to entry. In this episode, we will discuss all of the matters above and consider why space matters to the UK. I'm Victoria Tariq-Samoline, co-founder and director of strategy at the Council on Geostrategy, and I'm absolutely delighted to be joined by two guests today: Elizabeth Seward, head space strategy and future business at BAE Systems, and Juliana Suess, research analyst and policy lead for space security and at RUSI. Elizabeth Seward is head of space strategy at BAE Systems, where she's responsible for defining the strategic direction and new business delivery across defense and civil space. Previously, she was senior strategist for the same space systems division of Airbus Defence and Space. Elizabeth was a founding member and past leader of the Women in Aerospace Europe UK local group and a previous executive board member. Juliana Suess is a research analyst and policy lead for space security at the Royal United Services Institute and is the host of RUSI's War in Space podcast. Before joining RUSI, Juliana was an intern for the DCDC, the independent think tank of the Ministry of Defence. She holds a master's degree in conflict, security and development from King's College London. Elizabeth and Juliana, welcome.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
Hi, thanks for having me.
All right, so let's perhaps start with a simple task. Let's define what is space power. Liz?
Gosh, how do we put it in a sentence? Space has been defined as the fifth warfighting domain. So it's been recognised alongside air, land, maritime, cyber and space. So when you look at it that way, it is just a place that activities happen. And space power for me is, do you have the ability to operate in that domain? And do you have the abilities to both interact with your allies, provide technologies and applications and uses to your defence and civil sort of forces and priorities and governments? And are you able to protect those assets that you have?
Juliana, what is space power in your view?
That is a really difficult question. So I'm glad I'm not the only one who's sort of struggling to put a definition on that. But I do agree with are you able to actually do you have space capabilities and what kind of impact can you have with them? Are you able to leverage, for lack of a better word, those capabilities in space? I think that is perhaps a very incomplete definition, but I think, as you said, it's such an all-encompassing sort of phrase. So I think that might be the best that we can come up with in a sort of very short span of time.
I will reflect that it is a phrase that is very much used. So we all talk about space power and having space power, but there isn't a singular definition. And so I think that's also a key activity for us as a nation. What do we as the UK mean by space power and what are we looking for? And I think we've started on that journey. We've had the Defence Space Strategy published, the National Space Strategy published, the sort of setting out our capabilities and our goals. So it's something that we're looking at, but actually distilling our view of what is space power into one very small definition is perhaps something that we need to do as well as a country.
So there are, of course, different ways how we can look at space. Some people might immediately think about science and exploration. Others might think about commercial activity, whereas there's also this military and strategic aspect that is, of course, important. So what are the different applications of space power, Liz?
We tend to split the space domain up into different applications or different parts of the value stream. And I think that's a very good way to look at what can we do in space, and therefore where should you have activities that will give you an advantage in space or your space power. And so across the value chain, we see it's building hardware, launching satellites, the actual launch capabilities, then it's being able to operate your satellites, and then it's the applications and data that you get from them. And so that's our value chain. And then within that, we split things by different markets. Telecommunications is the oldest use of space from that very first Sputnik beep to how we do it today. We have Earth observation, or ISR, the intelligence, surveillance and reconnaissance. We have human spaceflight activities, and we have things like navigation, P&T, position, navigation and timing. And we're often inventing new applications, but they all follow that value chain of you must create your payloads, your hardware, put it on a satellite, launch it, operate it, and then get your value at the bottom.
Juliana, is there any crossover between military and commercial use of space capabilities?
That's an excellent question. I mean, the thing that we talk about with space all the time is a sort of dual use dilemma, in the sense of obviously there's many applications or capabilities in space that can be used for civil as well as for military purposes. One person's Earth observation could be another person's intelligence, right? So there's definitely dual use in the sense of there's a lot of crossover in terms of what we use space for. So for example, P&T, as Liz already mentioned, positioning, navigation and timing. Obviously, GPS can be used for, for troop movements, for Blue Force tracking, but it can also just be used to, find the next train station or sort of find the destination through your sat nav, right? So there's a lot of crossover in terms of, how civil capability translates into military capability and vice versa.
It's a really hot topic at the minute, dual use, and how can we actually make some systems dual use, because the regulations are sometimes different and the budgets are very different and the use cases, but then as Julian said, that hardware and technology is the same. So at the minute we're, as the UK, looking at what do we do around illegal fishing? How do we support our maritime environment? How do we do that both for the civil government use cases and then also the sort of defence and security use cases as well?
I just want to sort of come in as well with a distinction that I just caught myself in not making properly. But obviously we do have a difference also between dual use and dual purpose, in the sense of some things are designed to have sort of dual purposes, and some we consider dual use because they could be used for different use cases, but they're not necessarily designed as such. So I think that's an important distinction to make that I just failed to make. So I just want to add that.
Let's try to take a step back and see how the importance of space has changed over recent years, if it has at all, of course. So my observation would be that in the late post-Cold War period, that relative geopolitical stability coupled with maturing space technologies probably created that good environment for private investment to drive that space market. And that growth was kind of unencumbered by any kind of significant political constraints. But nowadays, with this increasing geopolitical rivalry, it probably means that space environment also is becoming more and more contested and perhaps as subject to more sensitive security considerations and calculations of national security interest. So what's your view, Juliana, on this? How has it changed in recent years?
Yes, I do think there's a consideration that we need to add, which is we do have this perception sometimes of space as this peaceful place that we've sort of explored for scientific reasons, and that it's now being sort of weaponized. And I don't think that's quite true, because ultimately the very reason that we entered space all the way back in the 50s was actually for military reasons. And the sort of predominantly what we saw in terms of the space race that obviously took place between the Soviet Union at the time and the United States during the Cold War, a lot of that was just sort of showing off about your missiles. It wasn't really about the sort of importance of space. So I do think we need to be careful in sort of how we perceive of space and how we think that perception of space has changed. What I do think has certainly happened, and I think you're absolutely right in pointing that out, I do think that the geopolitical tensions that we've seen over the last 10 or so years has definitely had an impact in space as well. And I think space, I would always argue, is an extension of the politics that we see on Earth as well. All that sort of power play, all that sort of competition is projected into space as well. And obviously with the developments that we've seen in technology, that has come a whole lot further over the last couple of years as well. So I do think we're paying more attention to it now. And I do think that we've sort of increasingly seen space also sort of move into the limelight when it comes to conflict. And obviously, the war in Ukraine is a perfect example of this.
And if I can add, I think another key difference is when you were talking, space was very expensive and very hard to get to, and it was very much controlled by governments and nations. So there were a few different launch vehicles, and the satellite was very expensive and very large. We've seen, Juliana briefly touched on that technology shift of you can do a lot with a small satellite now. And our technologies have shrunk so much and are now so advanced. You know, the difference between an IBM computer and an iPhone has happened in the space world as well. So the access to space is much cheaper. It's got a much lower barrier to entry. We see some more launch vehicles. The launch world hasn't quite caught up the same, but Elon Musk and his SpaceX rocket are launching now with that such a regular cadence. The number of satellites has gone up massively. And what that means is it's no longer only governments who have the ability to access space and launch their own satellites and systems. Commercial companies can do as well. So we're seeing commercial companies enter who don't only sell to governments, who sometimes sell to governments be able to access a much wider range of technologies and capabilities that they don't have to pay for in advance. And that's also providing a lot of interesting changes in how do you sort of keep track of who's up in space, the space environment, how space is used. It's changed dramatically.
Can I just want to jump in on that, because I think you're absolutely right, and I think the access to space has changed, you know, dramatically, even in just the last sort of handful of years, you know, let alone if we're looking at sort of larger picture of 40, 50 years. But I think that's what makes it so difficult to sort of define a space power. And it goes back to your first question, right? How do we define that? What are the sort of borders of that definition? And I think, and I'm sure we'll talk about that later on as well, but that also extends to sort of counter space capabilities, because you might have an actor that is perfectly capable of disrupting space capabilities or the services that space capabilities provide without being a space power themselves, right? If we're looking at cyber attacks, for example.
So let's talk about the UK and what space capabilities do we have? Elizabeth.
The UK has been involved in space since the beginning of the space race and the space ambition. We were a founder member of the European Space Agency. We were a founder member of the International Astronautical Federation, which has been running for a very long time. So it's something we have actually always done. We lead on telecommunications and telecom satellites and payloads. We lead on across Europe interplanetary rovers, but we're also one of the world leaders in small satellites. And in fact, Surrey Satellites was one of those first companies to build the much smaller satellites, which Sir Martin Sweeting called the washing machine sized satellites, and which has led to an explosion of companies doing this. And so we've got some very world-leading capabilities that we have developed over a very long time in a niche area. And we have managed to do this with a much smaller budget than many other countries. We do invest in our space sector, but we don't meet the same levels as some of our European counterparts. And certainly nobody can rival the amount of money that the US or China put into their space programs.
So what are the main trends now in the UK? What are we focusing mostly on?
We are focusing on maintaining our telecoms capabilities, we have produced military communication system since the 1960s and have delivered that, and it's moving into the next phase of that program. So it's called the Skynet program. We used the name long before James Cameron and the Terminator machines, and Skynet has been providing communications around the world for our militaries, both for the sort of defence uses, but also connecting our people back home to the UK to provide that sort of home connection as well. And the enduring capabilities section of the programme, what will happen for the next 20 years is in the planning stages now and early contracts. But we're also looking at Earth observation and ISR. We've got huge capabilities in small satellites, in LEO satellites, and lots of companies. We don't have enormous budgets. So we do as a country have to be very clever in how do we develop a programme? How can we take the best of British in all these areas, but in a way that we're not just leaving everybody to compete because there's not quite enough. But that's the really big focus. Is the UK announced its iStarry programme, and across government and across industry we're working together. What can the UK have, and how can we support the UK government in those next steps and building it out? And it ties into the European Union programme Copernicus, which we've re-entered as a country, to provide that civil use cases as well.
Juliana, let's perhaps talk a bit more about global trends as well. So currently our key ally, the United States, it is the leading power in space technology, but also Chinese and Russian technology and capabilities are catching up. Could you please provide an overview of what's happening globally when it comes to space power and space capabilities?
I mean, that's how much time do you have? I mean, we could spend several podcasts covering this. I think we've definitely seen a sort of trend towards more and more attention being paid to space. So I think what we've seen, and I think that the US sort of has kickstarted the trend, obviously, with the Space Force being set up in 2019. But also all over Europe, we've definitely seen space commands sort of popping up, mostly under the sort of auspices of the Air Force in the country. And sort of this building up of space capabilities and the sort of forming of coalitions and the sort of forming of alliances when it comes to building up capabilities as well. Obviously, NATO has added space into its sort of strategic approach, and has also said that space falls under Article 5, so any attack to, from and through space could potentially trigger Article 5, been called a domain as well. And I think that nomination as a domain has certainly made a huge difference in the sort of recognition of space as well. In terms of capabilities, we definitely see that growing in terms of capabilities are becoming much more sophisticated, but I think also as a result, specifically militaries are becoming more and more dependent on space capabilities as well. And I think as a result, obviously this dependence also creates a vulnerability, right? So what we have seen also, again, that's not entirely new, that's not new to the last 10 years, but we've also definitely seen sort of counter space measures and weapons being developed. Again, a lot of these programs date back to the Cold War, but we have also seen a sort of resurgence and a sort of renewed focus on those kind of capabilities, namely Russia. We've definitely seen evidence that Russia's been building back at least some of its Cold War era counter space capabilities.
So what, in your view, are the main challenges and threats from our adversaries facing us and our allies and partners in space?
There's a whole range of risks that we do need to take into account. And specifically, if we talk about counter space measures and capabilities, these range from temporary measures such as jamming or spoofing, all the way to permanent, in the sense of, you could potentially have a kinetic attack on space. Now that, at least for the moment, remains a red line. So these kinetic counter space weapons have been tested, but only ever on the state's own satellites, never on other satellites. So I do think we have seen sort of counter space measures and weapons become almost part and parcel of modern day warfare. I mean, we've obviously seen the attack on Viasat the morning of the invasion of Ukraine, and sort of continuously news coming out about, this where counter-space measures might be going in the future as well. So I think there's a whole plethora of risks that we now need to think about, but also, there's just the sort of everyday environmental risks that are part of being a space actor, right? So that's solar weather, but also space debris that we do need to take into account.
Liz, given our heavy reliance on space capabilities, how can we protect ourselves from any potential risks?
There are a lot of activities looking at that, some of which we can't talk about on a podcast, some of which we can. We've always had a certain level of protection around our satellites in terms of cyber protection and anti-jamming. Some of those direct attacks that Juliana talks about, the anti-satellite weapons, it's very difficult to protect against. But as a country, we have a very strong and leading ability in cyber and in our cyber capabilities. That is a really key area that we are making sure we do in space as well, so that we can have that assured capability and assured connection against some of those threats.
Do we cooperate with our allies and partners when it comes to building space capability?
We definitely do.
Or is it more kind of an individualistic approach still?
There's strong collaborations around the world. Space is the one place you can get that global picture. A satellite in low Earth orbit will cover the world in 90 minutes, or will orbit the globe in 90 minutes. And so depending on the height of it, you can get a global picture in a couple of days. If you put a few satellites up, you can have that daily global picture. If you put as many as Starlink have, you can have that in sort of continuous view of the world or connectivity. And so it is global by its very nature, which means that you need ground stations around the world. You need that global connection. And so it really is built for us to work with partners and allies for. There are several different mechanisms that do that. The earliest one I talked about is the International Astronautical Federation, which brings together all the spacefaring nations of the world, even today, and has an annual meeting every year. But then there are the more operational sides of things. So we have something that the UK is involved in called CSPO, I'll have to remember the acronym, but it's about combining space operations together and brings together some of those newly created space commands to look at how do we operate in space and how can we work together. We could also do, if we combine systems, we can then have a stronger capability shared among nations so that you can share the costs and the use cases. Again, some of these things we've been doing for a very long time in various areas. Our weather forecasting, for instance, has been a joint collaboration between the American NOAA organization and the European EUMETSAT organization, our two meteorological organizations. And the Americans have built a set of satellites and they looked at the morning, and we built a set of satellites that looked at the afternoon because they made their orbits that way, and they've shared data for decades. We've built instruments in the UK that have been delivered both to NOAA and to EUMETSAT so that the data is common, the calibrations are the same, they get exactly the same data and we share it. And so we've got models to do that and we've got ways of doing it, and it's very important.
Juliana, in the last 12 months, we have seen 3 lunar landings, including the first landings by India and Japan, making them the 4th and 5th countries to have landed on the moon, as well as the first landing by a private company, Intuitive Machines, just last month. What about us? What other opportunities for the UK are out there in space?
I think there's plenty of opportunities for the UK in space. And I think there's also many different sort of channels through which the UK can, be a space actor. One of which is obviously ESA, the European Space Agency. But also, if we're thinking about wider collaborations, obviously in the military domain, I think that would definitely be NATO. NATO has said that there's no sort of ambition to actually build its own or have its own satellite. It's all about sort of what members sort of can put forward. And I think collaboration, as Liz has already touched on, is a huge element of this. And I think there's definitely sort of room for the UK to do more on this. Obviously, the UK is already a huge actor in space, specifically if we're looking towards the satellite communication space. Obviously, Skynet is a sort of tried and tested program that has been running for a really long time, and that is continuously invested in and sort of developed. But I think there's still plenty of, forgive the pun, but space for the UK to sort of get involved in and sort of be a big player. And I think part of that has already been, if we're not talking about capabilities, I think the UK has been a really prominent diplomatic power when it comes to space, specifically in the UN.
So I have some stats from ATS from last year, 2023, on UK space sector. So it generated 5.9 billion worth of pounds in exports, 7 billion pounds value added, 48.8 thousand direct employees, over 2,000 apprentices, and 17.5 billion in turnover. That sounds a lot, and we probably can certainly say that it contributes to the UK's prosperity and security. Is that right, Liz?
Absolutely, it certainly does. Both directly and indirectly, as you sort of alluded to, we have those direct jobs, but we also have all of the roles enabled by space, which turns that number into enormous numbers of hundreds of thousands. So it's really, really important. We're seeing a change in what the UK does, and it's an incredibly exciting period of time. We've had that traditional satellite manufacturing and also downstream data applications we've been very good at. But we now have a venture capital fund based in the UK who focus solely on space, and it was the first to do so, although there are now many more. And they've really helped grow the venture capital input into space companies. That change in technology cycle, the fact that we can do more with less money, means that it's in the realm of a venture capitalist who wants to invest to see their investment grow and then sell in about 10 years. And now you can get those timescales in the space domain, which has then triggered lots and lots of new small companies in those new exciting areas that you were just talking about. One is based in Wales called Spaceforge, who are looking at manufacturing in space. So you can create amazingly pure semiconductor materials in a microgravity environment that you can't do on Earth. And that's a real growth area. And then with the lunar landers, for instance, you talked about the first ever commercial lunar lander. And we have other really exciting projects like that are a UK possibility as well. One that I've been following recently is the International Space Station will reach the end of its life shortly, and the next plan is not to build another government-owned big international cooperation, but to do what has happened with that launch industry, to put government money into commercial programs to stimulate more space stations to go into orbit. And one of those is working with the UK on privately funding astronauts to go into orbit. So we as a country are looking at how do we do things differently? How do we bring in different ways of investment and funding and different organisations, but to keep that access to space?
So what are those emerging technologies or capabilities to look out for in the upcoming years, in your view?
So what you can do with a satellite will still be key. That global picture, that global view of telecoms and Earth observation, that's the sort of bedrock of space activities. But now we are putting people back onto the surface of the moon with the Artemis program, and we're seeing these commercial space stations in development that will have more humans in low Earth orbit. And then it really is the microgravity environment and what can we do there. Materials manufacture is the key part, but not just semiconductors or metals. There's actually an ability to grow organs in space and do medical experiments where there's the most amazing piece of research around brain tumours for children, because you can build up a sort of a template to see how these tumours change in a microgravity environment that is not possible on Earth. Everything just collapses in the presence of gravity. And so the biomedical and health applications are really big. And then if you're looking even longer term and bigger, there's a lot of rare materials in the asteroid belt, which means if we could send robotic mining to the asteroid belt, we could then stop mining our planet and our Earth environment. So we would have a safer, better planet, but we would still access those really key materials that we need from the asteroid belt. So yes,
that's absolutely fascinating. Also, environmental security issues that we haven't really touched on before, but we've just done it now.
Yes, and climate monitoring. There is a set of key climate variables that are how we know climate change exists and how we monitor it and how we are checking the progress and how we're seeing how we are not successfully stopping climate change so far. And of those, there's over 50 of them. Half of them are only measurable from space. So those satellites are absolutely key in, first of all, helping us see the problem and now helping us track it and monitor it. And once you get a satellite into orbit, it runs on solar power, so they are very green once they're in space, so that they can really help with that climate and climate change.
Juliana, what are other opportunities that we should think about and pursue in the future?
I think there's so many, and Liz has already touched on a few of the sort of technologies to look out for. I think two that I would pick, because I have to pick, don't I, before we sort of talk for too long. But I think specifically from the sort of defense and security sort of angle that I'm coming from, I think the technologies that I'm particularly excited about are those that increase the resilience of satellites and those that actually increase the sort of sustainable life of a satellite. So satellites and their payloads specifically are becoming sort of increasingly digitized in the sense that there's more sort of software elements that can be changed. So, obviously the problem that we have at the moment, once the satellite's up there's not really much that we can change about that satellite. Specifically the hardware, obviously we can't change, but there's more and more components that actually allow us to update the software of a satellite from Earth. So we can, potentially add sort of missions to the satellite or potentially give it further capabilities that it didn't previously have. So I think that's really exciting. And another one is inter-satellite links. So that allows satellites to speak to each other, to send signals to each other, either through radio frequency or, for example, through laser technologies. That would be optical communications, that then allow satellites to potentially circumvent a ground station if it's no longer working, if it's compromised, etc., to sort of relink communication sort of quicker than we were previously able to, which also gives the whole system more resilience.
And we have a very exciting project at BAE Systems, which is doing many of those things. We have a reprogrammable element with a set of payloads on board, optical and radio frequency. But as Juliana says, you can change those mission parameters after launch because it's reprogrammable. And it has those inter-satellite links on to really speed up the communication. So lots of those technologies have existed, but not necessarily all in the same place. So it's really exciting to see them develop on orbit.
Well, it seems that there are limitless possibilities in limitless space that's above us. And it's wonderful to see that the United Kingdom is working towards making sure that we use all of them in the upcoming years and we are refocusing our attention on space. Thank you so much for listening to Defence Talk, Securing UK Advantage, brought to you by the Council on Geostrategy in partnership with ADS and sponsored by BAE Systems. If you would like to submit a question for our next episode, please email them to defencetalks@geostrategy.org.uk. Thank you for listening, and until next time.